Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 27 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I am an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or a follower, or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. Excuse me. Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome for this podcast. All the new subscribers this week, greatly appreciated. And including a new paid subscriber, thank you very much. I will not mention names, but thank you very much for your support. It's greatly appreciated. So we had 4 papers this week. One of them was relatively short, one that actually got posted today. The first one is the Beijing Xinjiang Forum, A Fool's Errand, West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 15, Ukrainian Victory Plan, a new plan to be released next week, and what is next for Boeing Starliner. All right, so we will start first with the Beijing Xinjiang Forum, A Fool's Errand. This was the 11th annual meeting, and it's, I guess it could be summed up as a call for a zero-sum world order. The forum is hosted by the Beijing International Convention Center. It is a 3-day annual meeting, and it is meant to be an opposite of the Shangri-La Dialogue. That's the annual one in Singapore, because China views the Shangri-La Dialogue, which China is invited to, as a Western-centric, Western world order type arrangement, and does not stand for Chinese values that they are trying to promote worldwide. So they created this forum as a counter forum to the Shangri-La Dialogue. So many of the participants in the Beijing Xinjiang Forum also participated in the Shangri-La Dialogue. So there's a lot of overlap. It's just in this case, the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA can designate or command the agenda of the dialogue or the forum. So the focus of the conference is on this year's conference anyway, is on security cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region, multipolarity and the international order, the global south, and global security governance. And you can see here's where you see a lot of the difference between the Shangri-La Dialogue and the Xinjiang Forum is the focus of the Chinese forum is, again, the global south, global security governance, and the international order. And this comes in is because they see, oftentimes when you hear the West and Western supporters, they talk about a rules-based order, which is often talking about, in the case of what's in the Asia Pacific, again, a vast ocean area, is when you talk about the law of the sea and a rules-based order, and what currently occurs in the South China Sea, which has become a global flashpoint. The other one is, so the international order is that the Chinese and its allies think that the current world order of that rules-based order is, yes, they believe in a rules-based order, but they have a different set of rules they want to follow. And they do not want it to be one that is dictated, in their words, by the West. The global south, that's also another part. That's the developing countries, many of them BRICS countries, and BRICS is mainly focusing on the global south and the developing world. And so where oftentimes they set the focus from the Chinese point of view and the Russians' point of view, and maybe to a lesser extent the Indians, their point of view is that the current world order has been set forth by the rich nations. Think of it as the G7, the European Union, the United States, and its allies are the ones that have been setting the agenda, even to the point of the IMF, International Monetary Fund. The UN set up itself. The Global South is promoting the idea of expanding the UN Security Council to give more members some type of veto power, maybe even a rotating Security Council, where more countries other than the victors of World War II will have a veto power in the UN Security Council. Again, so bring more cooperation or more power to the Global South from what they see as a international body that is set up to support Western ideals, even though China and Russia both have, again, both are BRICS nations, both have veto power and permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. So they don't really designate the idea of how would they be willing to give up their seats as well in a expanded Security Council. So these are some of the things that go on when you talk about the view of the world. The other one is multipolarity. Is the right now, and the Russians have been kind of in supporting of this. They're not so much in the multipolarity train as the Chinese claim they are. Vladimir Putin himself has said that it is a bipolar world. It's the West against, basically he thinks of it as the BRICS or the developing world, or in some cases, everybody else with a large form of neutral countries or non-aligned countries. So he believes that it's just simple like it's been during the Cold War. And basically the multipolarity has basically gone back to World War I. When you look at how the alliances have formed even prior to World War I, we are basically in the same type of situation that only took a brief pause during after the end of the Cold War, where the institutions of the West survived and the Russians were much diminished, and the Chinese were still growing at the end of the Cold War. So they weren't the economic power they are today. So there was a brief period where there wasn't really a bipolar or multipolarity part of the world because it was basically dominated by the West. I know they often say the winner of the Cold War. I don't really, the idea is winners or losers in a war that never actually fought, which was a good thing, but it's just, I think it's a little bit of arrogance to sit there and say that there was a winner of the Cold War just because one outlasted the other. I often say that the advantages of the Cold War ending have been squandered to where we are today. So you got the Chinese arguing for a multipolarity world, and that's in their forum. You got the Russians who kind of give lip service to it, but have basically stated in public they support a bipolar world. And I actually think that in the end is China also supports a bipolar world as well, as they have closely aligned with BRICS and with the Russians in some form of I'll call it a loose union. Certainly not something like NATO, but they are definitely, as President Xi Jinping has said it, is a friendship without boundaries. So that's a pretty close alliance between two countries. So the forum was attended by Russia, a close ally of China, as I stated before. And this is something somewhat unusual because Russia has, because of the fallout of the Ukraine invasion of February 2022, Russia has been disinvited, has been to many international global conferences. Obviously, you can't get kicked out of the UN because it is a permanent member of the UN, and you can't expel a country, and certainly can't expel a veto member because simply they could veto any type of action to take against them. So, but for the most part, Russia has been cut out of many meetings worldwide. So the continued diplomatic isolation of Russia, and it's like, if you want to ever find an end to the war, negotiate an end to the war, at some point you have to have more diplomatic contact with Russia, even if you firmly disagree with their point of view. During the Cold War, when the missiles and the nuclear weapons of 25,000, roughly 25,000 each between the Soviet Union and the United States, they still talked, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This lack of contact between the old bipolar rivals of the United States and Russia has been an issue. But again, Russia did attend this one because obviously China is going to invite Russia to this conference. So the Russian delegation was represented by Russian Deputy Defense Minister Alexander Fomin. Most countries sent defense-related people, fewer foreign ministry and State Department type people were represented at this one because it was mainly a defense dialogue. So the Russians sent Deputy Defense Minister Alexander Fomin, who is quoted as he supports the creation of a just multipolar world based on equality and respect, mutual respect. So interesting, because that kind of throws in the face of what his boss, President Vladimir Putin, says about the idea of reforming a bipolar world. He's talking about a multipolar world, but he's probably not wanting to rock the boat of the Chinese hosts and their Chinese allies. They are very closely aligned, and so the multipolar world is being loosely used by both China and by Russia in this respect at the forum, based on equality and mutual respect. So it goes into questions. Of course, there wasn't a lot of questions that could be asked. So, well, what about the war in Ukraine? How's that tied into equality and mutual respect? That would go into the point of one of the papers I just wrote about the Russians' view of the West playing a responsibility in what has happened in Ukraine. So again, we get into a lot of this twisted logic, and a lot of it is just flowery, diplomatic doublespeak that doesn't really tell you much of anything. You probably learn more by what's not said or how something is words are carefully crafted than what some of these statements that come out in the press. Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun criticized the Western order, and I talked about this before earlier, criticized the Western order of the world, urging major countries to take the lead in safeguarding global security and abandon a zero-sum mindset. So this was interesting. So he talks about, again, they're talking about criticizing the Western world order, and that's, again, the reason why this forum was created, to counteract that Western-dominated view at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. Urging major countries to take the lead in safeguarding global security. Not a lot of specifics about that, but does that say that there's an interventionist type policy for safeguarding global security? You can say that major countries do play a role, that they played some role in safeguarding global security. You could say, for example, off the coast of Somalia with the piracy issues. Can't say so much about what's going on in the Red Sea right now, but let's go back over to what's going off the coastlines, where there's actually Western navies and the Chinese Navy operate together in the off the coast of Somalia to allow shipping to be flow freely through the area without the threat of Somali pirates. So there is, sometimes you could sit there and say that, yeah, there is where major countries that have Navy can take the lead in safeguarding global security. But how does that regard into, let's say, the South China Sea, where they say, where the United States, Japan, and China are at odds over that rules-based order? Again, the West says about a Western rules-based order. The Chinese argue that they have their own view of the world. For example, the South China Sea from the Western perspective that was arbitrated by UN Maritime Court, went back to rules of ocean and navigation, freedom of navigation, and some of these treaties go back before World War One, and stated that how the seas are to be regarded as far as economic zones, territorial waters, and freedom of navigation. Well, these are rejected by China, and they believe that they can, using the 9-dash line, that they can just point to the whole South China Sea and say, that's ours, because we have some loose historic claim. A historic claim they didn't claim prior to the 1970s when they all of a sudden found gas and oil in the region. Now, China didn't care about that at that point, but all of a sudden they cared, and they came up with some bizarre historic claim for the whole South China Sea. Now, obviously, China was early has a rich history. They obviously had ships and navy that did sail throughout that region and had trade within that region. But to say that gives you a historic claim, because could the British Empire, couldn't they just argue the same thing? That they had, through their navy, having early in their development, that they mapped out much of the world order. So if China's claim, this historic claim over the South China Sea, because they were an explorer of the region, which is undoubtedly true, couldn't the British and the Royal Navy argue the same thing when they went through in the exploration phase, maybe even places like Spain as well? Couldn't they make these large, same sweeping claims that the Chinese make? So again, it was not the Chinese view of world order is if they go in there and you accept their version and that you say consistent with the logic, it would mean that a large portion of the world oceans would actually be the domain of the Royal Navy. So it's kind of funny they don't bring that up. And the other one is that Chinese come up with the point of the idea of a zero-sum mindset, which basically is that there's somebody's win is another person's equal loss. And so they're saying that there shouldn't be any cases of that victory should not be defined as zero-sum mindset. Again, this is flowery language. It's the idea about negotiated settlements. Negotiations they don't want to take in the South China Sea, but they talk about it. So it's this flowery language. It's more of an attack on the West than it is doing some inward reflection of their own policies. Despite criticisms of the United States and its interventionist policies, which does have some bearing of truth to it, China and Russia are presenting a delusional propaganda aiming to establish a bipolar world rather than a multipolar one. And I argue that I view, when I look at it, is that China and Russia are working closely together. Russia has a lot of the military industrial complex for advanced weapons, especially in aviation, and China is catching up quickly. But Russia is still probably considered the more advanced military power as far as technology goes and be able to produce that technology. China obviously has greatly overshadowed Russia as the economic power. So you combine these two countries together between the power of the Russians, especially their much larger nuclear power, and then China with their great economic power that's only second to the United States. And they represent a massive bloc. And they are the main players in BRICS. They are the ones that are really designating the policy of BRICS. Brazil to a lesser extent, but really this is being driven so much by China and Russia. India works hard not to get itself up in foreign entanglements. They seem to view BRICS as, yes, they are a developing country. They do not want to be held to necessarily the Western world order, but oftentimes India doesn't want to be held to anybody's order. India is out for India, and that's not a bad thing if countries focused more on what is in their self-interest and realizing that other countries work in their self-interest, and that's a point of negotiation. It's so that when I talk about that with India, that's not necessarily a criticism, as much as they purposely do not want themselves to be tied in or boxed in by any um, alliance. And that includes Quad, which is going on now with the United States, and also with BRICS, which they are part of, which has their annual meeting next month in Russia. So it's one of those things where it's kind of delusional propaganda. There was just no real purpose. There's no speaking against the orthodoxy that is being produced as much as this was. Again, it was an anti-Western um, type meeting. A lot of lecturing coming from both the Chinese and the Russians, less so from the guest countries, because they were within China, and again, the agenda was being designated by the Chinese. Um, so the Chinese and Russians aimed to introduce an alternative and competitive approach to the rest, mainly focusing on BRICS, the end of the petrodollar, and reforming the international monetary system. Now, this was not necessarily designated at this defense forum, but these are goals that kind of have where the idea of this, they call it the multipolar world, but basically their new bipolar world. These are things that they're trying to focus on to try to rally nations to their cause. And the idea is, can they create an effective union to rival the West? That is a big question. So there are, again, a viable economic system is required for any type of maintaining a military and an effective diplomatic policy that's backed by either soft finance. It sounds really bad, but if you have no military and no money, and you can't swing, you don't have a lot of influence, you're not going to be a power that can generate a lot of change in the world. Unfortunate reality. President Eisenhower had talked about that early on, where even the smallest country should be able to sit down. I think he was looking at it from the UN perspective of sitting down at a table and having as much respect as the bigger ones. That does not exist, not even in this Chinese and Russian model. They want to designate, they want to dictate to the smaller countries that align with them. So it's like, it's one of those things. It's like it's a lot of delusional propaganda. So they talk about this alternative and competitive approach to West that they want to lead, and that includes BRICS, the end of the petrodollar, and reforming the international systems, like the UN, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the monetary system. They're talking about creating their own currency. They want to be able to trade in the national currency and not rely on a trade based on the euro or the dollar. That's what the petrodollar is. Oil, for the most part, is being traded in dollars. That might be coming to an end soon, as Saudi Arabia is their agreement with the United States and trading oil in dollars has actually expired. It's a question of, what does Saudi Arabia want to do, because the petrodollar also included security arrangements for the kingdom. And there's maybe a soon-to-be nuclear-armed Iran on that side of the Persian Gulf. So, but that kind of went off the question, or went off the rails there. The question remains, can Chinese and Russian create an effective union to rival the West? So I go into this and talk about, okay, if they're trying to gather the global South, which is going to be mainly the BRICS alliance for, probably, well, not mainly, but it's the one that really is highlighted, that they're really the Russians and the Chinese, to a lesser extent the Indians and the Brazilians, are really working. And of course, they're not the only country as well, but they're really spending effort to try to bring more countries into this to really counterweight the rough equivalent of the G7. So the BRICS, though, and so you talk about, can they create an effective union rival the West? So the BRICS is bringing in such diverse rivals as China and India. Iran and Egypt. And then you have future candidates like Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is a rival to Iran. They've also supported the civil war in Yemen, Sudan, who is under a civil war, Vietnam, which has issues with China and the South China Sea, Pakistan, which has issues with India and Iran. Don't remember, Iran bombed Pakistan earlier this year and kind of vice versa. So it's to sit there and have that many diverse countries form a union that can be rival to the G7 and the Western Order. It's a tall order, and it seems like it's unrealistic for Chinese and the Russians to be able to form BRICS into an effective counterweight to the G7. And I think so. Though there's many alignment with BRICS, and they would care to work with BRICS, they're probably going to have to work on their own different approach of things. And then if it's the Chinese and the Russians forming some type of alliance, how does that alliance stay together? As Russia Russia is going to grow poorer through this war. I know their GDP is growing through the Ukraine war, but a lot of it's through spending a lot of their future, deficit spending as well, spending it on war, and war doesn't create, you create products just to be destroyed. You're not creating products to grow the economy. So they're trading off a lot of their values, even though their future growth, even though they're growing right now. So Russia grows poorer and China grows stronger. How does that relationship between the two work? At some point, it seems like Russia is going to have to become the minor partner to the Chinese. And how will that work? Because China and Russia have territorial claims against each other. China has got to the point where it's actually started designating parts of the eastern regions, the Pacific regions in Russia, as they're giving them Chinese names on the maps. I think the Russians are taking notice of that. So it's one of those questions is, yes, they created this seminar or this forum to counteract the Western point of view and try to rally some type of anti-Western world order into proposing something of their own new world order. But the question is what they're proposing enduring, and is it really multipolar? And I say no, it's bipolar. It's going to be the Chinese-Russian axis trying to create and trying to cajole other countries, maybe through BRICS, to try to align with their point of view. And BRICS will be too diverse, have too many diverse rivals to be able to speak as one voice. So it felt like very much a propaganda mission. There was no real answers. It was a bunch of flowery language and sweeping statements that didn't really equal to the rhetoric of the meeting. So it'll be obviously more to come. It'd be interesting to see how that Chinese-Russian axis eventually, how cooperation works. And then where does it go once President Putin of Russia is generally old? People thought he was in good shape, but there's questions about his health. President Xi Jinping of China also has health issues of his own, disappeared for quite a few weeks with speculation that he might have had an illness. So, at some point when the new leaders take over those countries, how does this shake out between China and Russia and the formation of an axis to be able to rival the West? So obviously more to come. Just interesting seeing how that forum had language, but and a lot of grandiose statements, but not a lot of actions equal to where they want to go with the world. So more to come, obviously. Next is the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 15. Okay, so there has been, we've talked about the West Philippine Sea Newsletter much of the disagreements or the clashes between the Philippines and the Chinese has been in the Second Thomas Shoal and around the Sierra Madre. There was obviously some issues with around some of the other shoals, including the Sabina Shoal, which is known as the Escoda Shoal in the Philippines. But for the most part, the focus was on the Second Thomas Shoal and the grounded ship, the Sierra Madre. Prior to the ASEAN meeting, the Philippines and the Chinese reached an agreement to allow resupply to the Sierra Madre after a flashpoint incident where the Chinese Coast Guard captured Philippine sailors, damaged equipment, captured two rigid boats of the Philippines. Again, captured the sailors, threatened them with, I called them Chinese pirates, the ones with axes, knives, and picks and spears, going after Philippine sailors. It's funny. I saw that term picked up on a website or on a channel on YouTube. I don't know if I am to be credited, but I do know they follow my work, and I think I don't want to say it's an original idea, but he did pick up. They seem to have picked up on my idea, calling them Chinese pirates, and so all they needed was more peg legs and eye patches, and it would have filled the vision perfectly of what they had done at the Second Thomas Shoal. Well, anyway, that incident was considered a major incident. A Philippine sailor had lost their thumb in the incident. No other injuries were reported. More concerning was the capture of Philippine sailors who were immediately returned to the Philippines after being seized. They were turned over to the Philippine Coast Guard, and the incident closed at that. But it did carry over prior to the ASEAN meeting, where that incident was going to probably become the focus of the meeting, which I think occurred in Laos. And so I think the Chinese just reached an agreement with the Philippines because they didn't want to turn the entire meeting into an anti-China affair about what had occurred in the Second Thomas Shoal, which is in the internationally recognized exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Just as I said before, the Chinese have a different set of rules they follow on their rules-based order versus what the rules are that the Philippines follow, which is based on an international order. But just to get you an idea, is that the Second Thomas Shoal is like 100 miles, 114 miles from the Philippines, and it's like almost 1,000 miles away. It's like 800 miles away from the nearest Chinese territory. It is obviously clearly within the territory of the Philippines. But so that's how far China makes their claims, again, using their definition of a rules-based order, because they're kind of gravitating to that language. It's just, they say they support a rules-based order because they're trying to mimic the West's argument to the world about following a rules-based order. They just have different rules to follow. So the Chinese had reached this agreement with the Philippines, and the Philippines agreed to it too. And what had happened was the Second Thomas Shoal was the prior to any resupply mission, that the Philippines would contact China to let them know that we're going around a resupply mission, or if there needs to be a medical evacuation, because China was blocking medical evacuations, both from fishing boats in the Second Thomas Shoal and from the Sierra Madre. So they've reached an agreement that they would allow this in exchange. The Filipinos cannot send building equipment to the Sierra Madre because the Chinese still publicly state that the Sierra Madre needs to be towed away, and the Filipinos publicly state it ain't going anywhere. So they just agree to disagree, but they would have some type of agreement that they could resupply. And why the construction equipment is important is the Sierra Madre is old. It's been grounded there since 1999. The Sierra Madre is a World War II era troop ship, served in the U.S. Navy originally. It's old. It needs work. It needs reconstruction before the whole thing collapses on itself. So the Philippines would occasionally run out construction equipment to strengthen the Sierra Madre. The Chinese say absolutely not. I have argued that this was more of a concession by the Chinese or by the Philippines to the Chinese because the Sierra Madre is within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, the West Philippine Sea, and basically the Philippines are asking Chinese permission to send supplies to their own territory. And since the Sierra Madre is a commissioned ship, it is sovereign territory of the Philippines. So they're having to ask permission to have access to their internationally recognized zone and their ship that is still manned, still commissioned, and does have sovereign immunity. So once that was settled, the flashpoint had changed from the second Thomas Shoal to the Sabina Shoal, again, the Escoda Shoal in the Philippines. The Escoda Shoal started coming into a flashpoint when the Philippines had discovered ground up coral and seabed damage in the area that reminisced what had happened in other shoals in the South China Sea. And that was where the Chinese would build up these shoals to raise the seabed, create basically ground up coral to raise the seabed above the water, and then use these as artificial islands where they could put personnel, military equipment, supplies to help refuel the Chinese Coast Guard, be able to fly aircraft if necessary. And this is what they did at, I think, the Scarborough Shoal. So the Chinese had a history of doing this, and it looked like they were doing that in the Escoda Sabina Shoal. And so just like the Scarborough Shoal, which was in the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, the Escoda Shoal is also in the Exclusive Economic Zone of the Philippines. So they suspected that the Chinese were trying to make another artificial island that they could maintain a manned presence on. The Philippines reacted by first doing an investigation to collect evidence, to do a lawsuit for an international lawsuit, and also to change Philippine law to recognize the environmental damage that was caused to the seafloor and the coral reefs. And the Philippine Justice Department will most likely file some type of international claim against the Chinese. The Chinese will not follow any international claim or any type of ruling that is done or that's been ruled on. If it's in favor of the Philippines, you can bet your dollar, your last dollar, that they will jump on board with a ruling or a court they call illegitimate. If it comes out on their side, they'll completely change their tune on that one. So that is most likely to come. Hasn't been filed yet. I know the law has been a Philippine law is being introduced now to their. I think it's in their Senate right now, but not 100% sure on that one. But the other part of the investigation is they wanted to stop the construction of the shoal, so they did what was called an extended deployment of its largest ship, the BRP Teresa Magbanawa, which is their largest Coast Guard ship, and they sent it to the shoal, again, called on a extended patrol to discourage further attempts to make it an artificial Chinese island. This has become a flashpoint. Originally, it was the Magbanawa was largely ignored by the Chinese because they were focused more on the second Thomas Shoal. even though the Chinese have more than enough resources to be able to have two um, flashpoints in the South China Sea and be able to manage them both, they pretty much just focused on the Second Thomas Shoal and uh, issued diplomatic complaints, and they did some aggressive maneuvering to slow down the Teresa Magbanua resupply, because the Philippines assigned two smaller vessels to the region as well to basically run supplies to the Teresa Magbanua. Um, the Once the issue was settled with the Second Thomas Shoal and the ASEAN meeting finished in Laos, the focus turned to the Sabina Shoal. And we started seeing ramming incidents of the resupply ships to the Teresa Magbanua. You saw aggressive actions to block ships getting close to the Teresa Magbanua, including fishing boats and Coast Guard vessels Philippine Coast Guard vessels. This was done by the Chinese Coast Guard and their maritime militia. You saw increased presence of ships in the region. At one point, the Chinese had 70 ships in the Escoda Shoal, including 8 warships. But the majority of those 70 was made up of the maritime militia, the Chinese maritime militia. The Philippines tried to do an airdrop to the Teresa Magbanua, and those were largely intercepted by boats from the Chinese, both from the maritime militia and the Coast Guard, which intercepted the supplies and destroyed them. Well, after all this, the Philippines had to withdraw the Teresa Magbanua from the shoal and return it to Palawan Island in what appears to be a victory of Chinese tactics. The Chinese were able to flood the area with so many ships that the Philippines could not operate effectively, and they could no longer to resupply the Teresa Magbanua. The Teresa Magbanua tried to maneuver to get to be able to receive supplies, and itself was rammed by the Chinese Coast Guard and had damage, which was above the waterline, but it did have damage. I think it said they had a 3-foot hole in it. So the Teresa Magbanua had to retreat and go back to the Palawan Island. They didn't have any more fresh water. They were reduced to trying to capture rainwater. They were eating emergency rations of some type of porridge. So not so much malnutrition, but dehydration became a problem, and there was actually 5 Coast Guard men that had to be removed from the Magbanua by stretcher when it arrived in Palawan Island. So this apparently looks like a win for Chinese tactics. They were able to flood the zone with so many ships that the Philippines could not resupply the Teresa Magbanua. So despite the this initial apparent victory, the Philippines remained defiant and said that they would resist any expulsion from the shoal, and that they would eventually send another ship to replace the Teresa Magbanua. But at the point of this writing, no ship has returned to the area, though it does sound like one is on the way, or at least the Chinese are warning of not sending the ship because they're sending more ships into the region. After the 70 were in the region, when the Teresa Magbanua left, the number of ships in the Sabina Shoal dropped from 70 Chinese ships to 11, as they probably went back to go resupply, and there was no more Philippine vessels in the area, outside of the normal fishing vessels, but there's no government vessels in the area anymore. So again, it looked like an apparent victory. So even though the Philippines said they're going to send another ship in, they had not. Now, the extended patrol this year of the Teresa Magbanua is what they called a virtual grounding, which is kind of a reference back to the actual grounding of the Sierra Madre. The idea is that the Philippines with the Sierra Madre grounded a ship purposely, left a commission, again, so that gives it sovereign immunity, and left the crew manned. So it created a manned presence in the second Thomas Shoal. The 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 Chinese have threatened to tow away the Sierra Madre, but they have not done so because, again, sovereign immunity. I wrote about this last week about the way the Chinese are trying to argue to get around sovereign immunity. So check out the West Philippine Sea newsletter, volume 14, on my Substack website if you are interested in that story. So the Chinese were saying that, hey, they're just basically doing it, the Philippines are doing a virtual grounding in the Sabina Shoal, and that they were going to threaten the same actions they were talking about with Sierra Madre, towing away. They were talking about towing away the Teresa McManawa like they would Sierra Madre. So because if you maintain a manned presence, it is much harder to try to make a claim on these islands. What happened with the Scarborough Shoal, I wrote a little bit about it in the paper. I won't go into too much here. The Scarborough Shoal was, again, a same type of incident between the Philippines and the Chinese with the two prior presidents. I think Aquino was his last name, and Duarte. The Obama administration, the U.S. President Barack Obama, negotiated a settlement between the Chinese and the Philippines over the stalemate, where both sides would pull their forces out of the shoal as the Chinese were trying to build up an artificial island. Well, the Philippines pulled out and the Chinese didn't, and nobody enforced the action. So the Chinese basically with no manned presence in the Philippines, because the Philippines agreed to this, or they followed what was agreed to, and the Chinese didn't. The Chinese were able to establish a manned presence on the Scarborough Shoal, which makes it much harder to try to take over the islands or these shoals. So that's what the Philippine or the Chinese point of view of what the Philippines were doing was they were doing a virtual grounding to try to maintain a manned presence in the region. Again, the Chinese ignoring what they did in the Scarborough Shoal. So the question comes up is, yes, it looks like policies of the Chinese had worked. They were able to flood the area with ships, and the Philippines were not able to effectively operate within the Sabina Shoal. So the question comes in is, if they do a mobile manned presence in the Sabina Shoal, like, for example, you have the Teresa McManawa sailing in the region around the shoal and able to maybe maneuver to try to get its supplies. It's using up fuel, and that means that's harder to resupply with just having a couple Coast Guard ships supporting it. Fuel becomes an issue because you're burning up fuel as you're going. The other thing is there are so many ships that they put in there, 70 ships they put in just before the Teresa McManawa was pulled out, is you're still going to have the same issue. The Chinese have so many ships, they could just flood the area and make it impossible for Chinese ships or Philippine ships to maneuver, on top of the fact that they do not hesitate, meaning the Chinese Coast Guard do not hesitate to ram other ships, including government ships of the Philippines. So if you do a mobile defense, you got to deal with ramming, you got to deal with just the number of ships in the area. The other issue is if you just drop anchor and you just set a presence like what the Teresa McManawa tried to do, is then they are going to isolate you, and this is what the Chinese did. They basically surrounded it with their ships and their maritime militia ships that the Philippines could not operate anywhere. They could not reach the Teresa McManawa to resupply her when they tried to drop supplies close to the Teresa McManawa. The Chinese had so many ships in the area, they were able to capture and destroy all the supplies meant to the Teresa McManawa. So the Philippines have a real issue on their hands. It's because both actions, whether it's a mobile presence by just sailing in the area, you're going to have to deal with ramming and just the fact that you're going to be outnumbered The other one is if you anchor, they're going to surround you because they have a superior number of ships, and you will not be able to resupply. So the same thing will play out with the Teresa Magbanawal unless you just go in there and you just send in ships, drop anchor, and just let them use up their supplies as much as they can, and you sail another one in. But will the Chinese eventually keep pushing by putting more ships in the area, kind of push the Philippine ships further and further out as they try to maintain some type of static presence? So the Philippine Navy or the Philippines do not have a lot of options available to them just because of the sheer number of ships that the Chinese can put in there. Now, this is not to say that the Philippine position is hopeless, because again, if the Philippines, because of their geographic location, I've written about this many times in the West Philippine Sea newsletter. You can go back and read those on Substack. Is they have the Philippines have the advantage of a geographic location, being in the first island chain, and the Chinese not in the first island chain. These shoals are much, much closer to the Philippines and much further away from the Chinese. So establishing effective air cover is a geographic issue for the Chinese. Also, can the Chinese effectively operate on the eastern side of the Philippines to try to put military pressure on the Philippines, much like they tried to do with Taiwan? Well, that's operating on the eastern side of the Philippines would be difficult for the Chinese because of the extended ranges, and that would mean also you would have to have fuelers of fuel. Either you have to rotate ships through there, or you would have to have some type of resupply at sea, which would be difficult. And if they did such a thing to the Philippines, would that call into question the ace that the Philippines have? And that is their defense agreement with the United States. There's only so far that the Chinese can go without calling into question or calling into the U.S. Philippine Defense Treaty, which the U.S. has clarified actions that the Chinese could, if the Chinese took certain actions, it would bring about the use of, or would bring into the defense doctrine or this defense treaty between the two countries. One of them is that the Chinese cannot use warships against the Philippine forces. Philippines, on the other hand, cannot use warships either. That's why you're seeing it as a Coast Guard battle. But you notice that the Chinese are starting to put warships into the area. Again, when they put 70 ships into the vicinity of the Sabina Shoal, 8 of those ships were warships. They didn't take place in the actions, but they were shadowed back. They were shadowed there to provide backup. So the Philippines kind of have that issue, is that their ace in the hole is they do have this treaty. So there's only so far the Chinese can go. But Chinese is a large, powerful country, and they can push a lot of buttons. And so they are able, with they have the largest Coast Guard in the world, and they also have this maritime militia. They can flood resources in the area and easily outman the Philippines. So yes, they can cause life be very difficult for the Philippines. But again, China can only go so far in the push. And so the Philippines are aware of that, and that they need to find a way to effectively operate on that. So the U.S. has offered to escort Philippine ships to resupply, or escort Philippine resupply missions through the use of the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Coast Guard to help resupply these ships. Now, the Philippines have turned this down because they want to use their own resources, and there are some certain laws involved in constitutional requirements within the Philippine Constitution not to bring in foreign powers to local conflicts. Though is the questions around this, and General Bronner of the Chief of Staff of the Philippine military would have to answer these questions, or he's brought up these questions about when is this no longer a local conflict, and those constitutional matters questions don't exist, because even though this is in the Philippines exclusive economic zone, it is outside of Philippine territorial waters, so it is in international waters. So there are questions about how Philippine law is to be um, considered, and that's an important factor in any type of conflict. Again, if you want to sit there and say you are following a rules-based order, you have to follow the rules. That kind of limits you, but if you're talking about, in this case, this is not a shooting war. This is the idea of a war of ideas, a war um, of winning, go back to Vietnam, the hearts and minds. And you can't break rules for your own purposes, or you can't break a rule because somehow that puts you at a disadvantage. This again is not a shooting war, so the Philippines are very careful to follow the rules to make sure that they keep that moral ground, and that's part of their transparency campaign to show that they're following the rules and the Chinese are not. So, but what they can do, and this has been offered, is that the U.S. Navy, perhaps, or the Coast Guard, send ships out into the areas to help provide cover to the resupply missions. Not saying the U.S. is going to directly resupply the Philippine ships, but they will provide the cover. Will the maritime militia be willing to get that close to a U.S. U.S. warship that is providing cover by basically causing us? Well, basically, Navy experts could go out there, but basically, the U.S. Navy provides, or the U.S. Coast Guard provide a cordon that doesn't allow any Chinese ships to get close to the Philippine ships to allow the Philippines to resupply. This is a case where the Philippines are doing the resupply mission, but basically the U.S., for lack of a better mission, is basically interdicting or blocking the Chinese from getting close to the Philippine ships to prevent the resupply mission. So that is an option. Japan is also a possibility. They have a very close defense relationship as well. The Chinese are not willing at this point to risk a war with the U.S. and Japan, even though they have stoked up anti-Japanese hatred over the last few weeks. A lot of that based on the anniversary of the Japanese start of their war with China prior to World War II that led to tens of millions of Chinese deaths, but that's a different story. Again, sidetrack. The Chinese will be less willing to risk damaging a U.S. warship or a U.S. Coast Guard ship trying to get at a Philippine ship, because that would very much create an incident between the U.S. and China, and it's not a war at this point that I think China wants to fight. If they fight a war in the Philippines, they're giving up their military option for Taiwan, and that's not an easy operation. But if they use up a large portion of their Navy fighting the U.S. Navy in the West Philippine Sea, that is certainly a war that's at the disadvantage of China, because most of the Philippines is outside of the air coverage of most of the Chinese Air Force, and the Chinese do not have a very big carrier fleet, so they cannot project power effectively against the Philippines. Again, because they would also be operating. You could expect U.S. carriers to be to the north and to the east of the Philippines at the extended ranges of the Chinese, and then the U.S. carriers could just most likely decimate the Chinese Navy operating east of the Philippines or close to the western side of the Philippines. So again, it's not a war in my mind. Again, I'm not an expert at it. There's probably many more experts at naval tactics, but it's just from knowing that air power is a major role in naval warfare. That's why we have aircraft carriers. If China is operating a campaign against the Philippines outside of most of their air cover, it's not really a war that you think is going to be winnable. So the Philippines do have the advantage of the geographic position, as long as Taiwan stays under Taiwanese control and not under China's control, because as soon as that happens, that means China's inside the first island chain, and that they can extend their air cover over the Philippines. So as long as Taiwan stays independent, China is going to have difficulty operating effectively against the Philippines, especially with that defense treaty with the United States. So the point is, there's only so far China can go in this disagreement with the Philippines under the current situation in the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea. So if the U.S., with that defense treaty, that creates a high deterrence bar for China. They are willing to push that. That's part of gray zone tactics. They will use that. They will push up to that limit. But there's only so far they can go unless they want to cross that boundary of that defense treaty. And then it's a war that China doesn't really want to fight. Now, I'm not saying the U.S. wants to fight it either, or Japan, but it could force the hand of fighting a war. So I don't think China wants to fight the war. I don't think the U.S. wants to fight a war. But so the Philippines just use this as pressure to know that China only can go so far against the Philippines. And if they want to go further than that, that's not really a place they really want to go, not at this time. So I'm sure there will be plenty more to come because this is not over. The Chinese appear to have succeeded in their tactics against the Teresa Magbanua. The Philippines are going to be sending a new ship to replace the Teresa Magbanua. If the tactic didn't work for Teresa Magbanua, is it really going to work for another one? Except if you start rotating ships in there, load them up with supplies, and have them run the cordon. Also, I made some points that maybe they could use some type of NGO, non-government organization, to try to interdict the Philippines or the Chinese maritime militia and Coast Guard, much like the Chinese maritime militia interdicts the Chinese or the Philippine Coast Guard. An organization like ATNITO, which actually helped break a blockade of the Second Thomas Shoal in December 2023, maybe something like that could work as well. But there's all types of risks of casualties involving civilians inside the fighting this type of war. So that's also in the my newsletter for this week. Not really going to go into detail here. So there will be certainly more to come as another round two in the Sabina Escota Shoal is coming. All right, next is the Ukrainian victory plan. New plan to be replaced or to be released next week. So the war had reached, Western intelligence agencies had released their latest figures. It's kind of a blended figure because everybody has a little bit different view. The Western intelligence agencies all have different views, so this is kind of a survey of their overall views. Is basically they think that the war has reached 1 million casualties. That's killed and wounded, both battlefield and civilian, in the war since it started in February 2022. The estimate is that Russia suffered 200,000 deaths and 400,000 injuries, and Ukraine has suffered 80,000 deaths and 400,000 injuries. Obviously, the Russians have been on the offensive much more than the Ukrainians have. In fact, the Ukrainians have been in a strategic defense since the end of their failed spring and summer campaigns of 2023. So they've been in a strategic defense for a year now. And the Russians are pushing hard in the eastern Ukraine. So obviously when you're on the offensive, you're going to be using up more casualties. I've also argued in a number of papers before is that the average Ukrainian soldier that has been armed with Western weapons tends to be more lethal than the average Russian soldier. Though I did have a comment from on Substack, a very great conversation, and it made reader made a good point and a correct point, is that the average Ukrainian soldier is over 40 years old. They don't have numbers on the Russians, but the Russian soldiers are much younger because many of them are conscripts. So they're 18, 19 years old. They do use contractors, uh, meaning the Russians as well, that tend to be older, but not as old as what you're seeing in the Ukrainian armed forces. Part of this is due to Ukrainian draft laws, and I've written about this before, and they finally came to a new conclusion about it, which slowed down. When they blamed it, they were taking that the Ukrainians were taking a beating during the war this year during the start of the Russian spring offensive. The Ukrainians somewhat rightfully said that that the weapon systems were slowed down because of budget arguments within the West, including both the European Union and the United States. The European Union had to deal with, and NATO had to deal with, the unanimous consent requirements. So they had to make workarounds around that. The U.S. was tying Ukrainian defense aid to southern border security bills. So it was kind of a political fight. So there were some delays in Western military equipment, but also the Ukrainians their parliament was in a disagreement over new draft laws. So they were delaying pulling up new soldiers, which did push up the age of the soldiers that were in the current field. But for example, the new law, or the old law, I'm sorry, you could not draft Ukrainian males under 27 could not be drafted. And then there was also some requirements that only so many males from a region could be taken. And this is due to some of the issues, and this has been happening especially in, well, both Western and Eastern Europe, is birth rates are declining. Russia has the same issue. And so they have adopted a policy of trying to, outside of the war, trying to increase the birth rate. So the argument for this was the Ukrainians did not want to give up a generation of new Ukrainians by sending the men that would be in a position of having families. They did not want to send them out to war and never have those families, never have the kids. Of course, the idea is that they're going to leave, they're going to have kids, and then they're going to leave mom to raise the kids on their own, which has happened in wars before. It's also kind of a view of, did they really think that the fact that these men not coming back, that they expected to lose a lot of men in the battle. So that means that what the Ukrainians have done is they started drafting older men, so that pushed their average age up. So the Ukrainians recently changed the law. It's down from 27 to 25. That increased the eligibility of the number of men that can be pulled into the service. The other part is it's also something else about the ratios that can be pulled in. Again, they changed the ratios where you can pull in more men from a region as well. So maybe they say, okay, well, you can only draft, the old law is something like you can only draft couldn't draft anybody under 27 years old. But then once they turn 27, you couldn't pull, like, I don't know the numbers, but this kind of gives you an idea, is you can't remove 50% of the population from a particular region of men. So you had to keep a certain number of men in there. So that kept the draft age down. But once up to 27, those above 27, the restrictions were removed. So again, they were pulling in a lot more men over 27 years old. And that's why you have so many older men inside the Ukrainian army when compared to the Russian army. And then the other side of the issue goes that they made a point of, and I've read this before, but I have not independently confirmed this, is that the average Ukrainian soldier only has about 6 months experience before they are killed or injured. Again, the ratios are you have a 5-time more likelihood of being injured than being killed, but still significant that the average Ukrainian soldier only has 6 months of experience before they receive an injury or are killed. Again, that's an average. That seems reasonable, just depending on the number of injuries. And of that 400,000 injuries, that does not mean that you're ineligible to come back to military service. but obviously you will be taken out of the line while you're injured. So the both Russia and Ukraine obviously do not agree on these laws. Neither one of them comment on their casualties. Ukrainians do give estimates of Russian casualties and not really talk about their own, or just very much at a high level. Again, it's an information battle, is they obviously try to underestimate their casualties and overestimate the Russian casualties. That's nothing new in warfare. I mean, the U.S. did it in World War II. You could sit there and talk about body counts in the Vietnam War. So obviously this is something that's been played more and more. So neither Russia or Ukraine will confirm or deny these counts. They just pretty much just ignore them. The results is Ukraine uses this as a reason to call for more weapons, and Russians just use it as an excuse to call the Ukrainian stooges of the West. So nothing was really accomplished by it, but it was a milestone. 1 million injuries and deaths in the war so far. So as I've been writing about, there is pressure on both parties to come to some type of peace in 2025, as more and more countries are siding on the idea of ending this war. And a lot of it's coming from the global south side, led loosely by China and India. I wrote about India. It kind of has the inside track that they might be the one party that could get Russia and Ukraine to agree to start talking. The Ukrainians have stated that they, because of the failure of the Swiss peace conference earlier this year, stated that the next peace conference that they have, and again, the peace conference in Switzerland was peace conference in name only. The Russians weren't even invited. And I wrote extensively about that. So the President Zelensky says that he would like to have talks with the Russians in November, along with international partners. And the international partners do include the Chinese. So they're wanting the Ukraine, the President Zelensky says he wants to hold direct talks with Russia, and it will be also being the international partners for both Russia and Ukraine at participating in these conferences. And again, I wrote earlier that it seems like India is the most likely one to be the mediator of these talks, but that hasn't been confirmed yet. So the Ukrainians, knowing that the failure of what they previously called a 10-point peace plan was not a peace plan, it was just a dictation of what Ukraine wanted for victory. So they come up with this Ukrainian victory plan, which hasn't been released, and oddly enough, President Zelensky says that he has to have that approved by the White House prior to presenting it at the UN General Assembly next week. So he says it's not completed. He has not released details of it, but there are some indications of it. First off is the idea of victory plan. Well, one country's victory is another country's loss, if you're talking from the very zero-sum game. And you can kind of go in there is that the Ukrainians have said that they're willing to negotiate with the Russians, including when they did polling of Ukrainian citizens. At this point, they're actually willing to talk to the Russians, which is not what they were willing to do early in the war. But they are also whole, or preponderance of the majority, I mean, probably a vast majority, are against territorial concessions to the Russians. So willing to talk, but not willing to give up anything. But these polling were probably something that has engaged on by the Ukrainian government to kind of an idea where the population was and how much are they willing to support going to peace talks with the Russians. So this Ukrainian victory plan is to be rolled out. And it appears, based on some pre-meetings that a Yalta conference that President Zelensky attended by video. He talked about it, and apparently the plan, he indicates that, is to restore the Ukraine borders of 1991, which is something that they have stated in their previous peace plans, that any peace plan must restore that integrity, territorial integrity. And this kind of goes back to the concerns of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine was given security guarantees by the United States and the United Kingdom in exchange for giving up nuclear weapon. It's the nuclear weapons inherited from the collapsed Soviet Union and have them returned to Russia. Well, they returned those nuclear weapons to Russia, but they did not get the security guarantees that were promised in the Budapest Memorandum. I wrote about that in my very first paper, which was my longest paper to date, about the Budapest Memorandum. I'm not going to say one way or another about the wisdom of that document, but it seems like as soon as the U.S. and the United Kingdom got what they wanted out of it, which was to stop nuclear proliferation, so weapons were removed from Ukraine and went back to Russia, and were actually eventually dismantled. Once the West got what they wanted, they were pretty much washed their hands of it. The Russians were not too concerned because NATO eastward expansion hadn't started yet. There was a hiatus where both countries were fighting some insurgency, like again the war on terror, some of the issues that the Russians were dealing with mainly through the Chechen rebellions, and much more controversially, the Georgia issue where they actually went to war with Georgia. One lasted about a week or so. So the idea is that they wanted to go back to the 1991 borders. That's apparently what's this new aim of the Ukrainian victory plan. And again, it seems like this is not something like giving up that concession to the 1991 borders is a concession that seems like most Ukrainians do not support. Diplomatic options for Ukraine include that. So what can Ukraine give to get back that territory? Obviously, the Russians are in a strong position on the battlefield, and the Ukrainians are also in a strong position. They're slowly being pushed back. They're slowly being grind down in a battle of attrition. But it would take a very long time for Russia to completely destroy the Ukrainians on the battlefield. So the Ukrainians are in a relatively strong position on the battlefield. The Russians are on a relatively strong position on the battlefield, where there is somewhat of a stalemate. Still give the edge to the Russians, just because of the demographics of their country. But the Ukrainians are going to be very strong as long as they continue to win NATO support. If the Ukrainians cannot win on the battlefield by removing the Russians, what can they possibly incentivize to get the Russians to completely pull out of Ukraine, including the Crimea? It doesn't seem like that's an impasse. It doesn't seem like there's anything that the Ukrainians would be willing to give, and a population that is not willing to give up any territory to the Russians. Now, I don't blame the Ukrainians for that. I mean, if the country was invaded, I would want my territory back. I wouldn't want to reward aggression. So it cannot fault the Ukrainian population. I can't really hold it against the Ukrainian government. Maybe you could argue about some decisions that were made that incentivize Russia to go to war, or at least give them an excuse to go to war. But there's no reason for Russia to go to war. There's no threat from Ukraine to Russia. A lot of the blame, I do put some of the fair amount of blame on the Ukrainians and the West. I also put a majority of the blame on the Russians because they did not need to invade. But they chose to do so anyway, starting in 2014 and again in 2022. So what can they give up for this? What can the Ukrainians give to get to incentivize the Russians to withdraw to the 1991 borders? And that is a tall order, especially if the Russians are not going to be kicked out of the battlefield. So Ukraine could agree not to join NATO or the European Union or become a partnership with either one of those countries. Like they could give economic concessions to Russia, basically pay the Russians to get out. Um, that could be a case where maybe allowing them to use the resources of the Donbass, the mineral resources, the gas, oil, and mineral rights in that region, maybe allow the Russians to use that, much like maybe in after World War One with the Rhineland area and Alsace and Lorraine. Um, or they could directly compensate Russia to exit, basically pay them money. But where are they going to get the money for that? Um, they maybe give pipeline rights to Russia to run more pipelines through Ukraine. But um, is the West going to be willing to buy Russian oil? So is it economically feasible for Russia to build more gas pipelines across Ukraine? It seems doubtful. So again, there's not a lot that Ukraine has to offer to get the Russians to give up their territory and restore the 1991 borders. So the alternative is that Ukraine has nothing to offer and that the West and Russia will negotiate its concessions. So basically, the West and Russia will negotiate the fate of Ukraine. Now, the many believe that the Russian grievances to go to war in Ukraine was grievances with the West after the fall of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991. So many analysts say that this was the real purpose of the war, is to force Russia or the West to negotiate with Russia to relitigate issues and agreements that Boris Yeltsin, the first Russian president of the Russian Federation after the fall of the Soviet Union, and again, Russia absorbed many of the or absorbed all the agreements that the Soviet Union signed. So he renegotiated. President Yeltsin renegotiated, but he did so at a point of weakness. Is Russia was an economic free fall. They needed to change their economic order. They needed assistance from the West in this. So there wasn't a lot of leverage that Russia had. So from the point of view is that Russia gave up a lot of concessions to the West after the fall of the Soviet Union, and as President Boris Yeltsin, was getting more and more ill, he was giving more and more away to the West. Then you got the corruption issues and all that. Well, Vladimir Putin was a deputy to Yeltsin, and he saw this later part of what he saw as the stab in the back from the West. Sounds really familiar. I don't know when he said the stab in the back. I think it was very early on, but it sounds very familiar to what the Hitler used in grievances after the end of World War One, the stab in the back type speech. To give President Putin his due, is he has not been a common statement that he has, probably because he knows how it sounds. But he had actual post-Cold War grievances with the West, including NATO expansion, which he even called out. Was that he said that the West said that they would never expand NATO into the former Warsaw Pact countries, but that was never in writing. And I've talked about this early on, is as much as the European Union and NATO like to put everything in regulation and have agreements to the nth degree of detail, they would never just do a verbal agreement saying, yeah, we won't do that. So it tends to sound out against President Putin, his point of view, but it is a grievance that the Russians had. So it is the case where maybe this is Russia's chance to uh, renegotiate all those agreements after December 1991 with the West. So it's not about Ukraine, it's about Western relations and resetting the order in Europe and its relations with Russia. So that's a possibility where basically they just ignore Ukraine altogether, or give them the West kind of gives them, uh, you know, uh, you got lip service type say so, but it's really going to be, um, not to be insulting, but the big boys in the room are going, the adults in the room are going to have the conversation, and they'll tell you what you're going to get. It almost feels like that is what could be in any type of real negotiation um, with the West. Now, it's not going to be easy. That's where I've talked about this. War is a disaster because there is just no real easy way out of this war without the Ukrainians not coming out whole. Um, the other issue is like, well, what concessions can the West get to Russia? Again, you're talking about grievances since 1991. Vladimir Putin has been the president since Boris Yeltsin resigned, um, which I can't remember the exact year that happened, but basically, he has been the hierarchy of power since basically uh, he's originally from St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad, and he was closely aligned with the mayor of St. Petersburg, who was closely aligned to Yeltsin, and he's been in this power structure almost since the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union, which Putin calls one of the greatest disasters of mankind. So he's got grievances or what he views as grievances that he wants to negotiate with the West. And so when analysts say that the actual purpose of the war was to renegotiate grievances with the West, it does seem to have merit that this is the real purpose, because it looks like no matter what that Ukrainian peace plan has, that's going to be rolled out to the United Nations General Assembly. There's nothing, unfortunately, that the Ukrainians have that could incentivize the Russians to leave, to go back to the 1991 borders. And again, the Ukrainians are not, their public polling is there are not, and this public polling comes from unoccupied regions, and it comes from less ethnic Russians that live in Ukraine. This is mainly from more Ukrainians, again, that are not under occupation, and they're from the western part of Ukraine, um, which tends to be more or less more Ukrainian and less Russian. Again, because there's a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, especially in the east, which has helped the Russians occupy more portions of the east because of a larger and apparently more loyal population of Russians in those parts of Ukraine. So there's just not a lot that the Ukrainians have, unfortunately, and this is terribly unfair to the average Ukrainian citizen who did not ask for this. So there is a lot of questions that maybe this war's whole purpose was to allow eventual negotiations between the West and Russia. Be interesting how this goes. So, as we have seen though, since the idea that the peace talks are coming, and I've talked about this, is several things are happening in 2025 that are going to put pressure on both countries to come to the peace table. But it seems like both countries are jockeying for position ahead of the peace talks. The Ukrainians have invaded Kursk region. I'm not sure how long they can hold it, and I'm not sure how wise it is to hold it for too long, at least not at the full extent of what they occupy now, especially with the mud season coming. And it could end up just being another area that could just be subject to Russian firepower and beyond, and it would be in a region that would be on the air cover that the Ukrainians could effectively support. So I've argued that they need to start pulling back prior to the start of the mud season, at least pull back the majority of it. But the idea is that they took part of Kursk as a embarrassment to Putin, and also to give them a bargaining chip coming into peace talks, something to incentivize the Russians to come. That is a general consensus of logic, and it does make sense. But if it's enough to make the Russians negotiate or make them dig in their heels, because the Russians and Ukrainians were in negotiations in Qatar prior to the Kursk invasion to discuss not bombing each other's energy infrastructure. Those talks were ended as soon as the as soon as the invasion of Kursk occurred. So, not sure if the Kursk invasion will be something to make the Russians dig in their heels, or if it's a concession the Ukrainians have to try to incentivize the Russians to leave eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So that's a possibility. The Ukraine has also been pushing for the United States and United Kingdom to end all restrictions on the use of and type of weapons donated to Ukraine and allow them to strike targets deeper into Russia. Now, I've talked about this before, is any weapon that's sold by the United States and the United Kingdom have agreements that how they are to be used. So if the United States sells, for example, weapons to the Netherlands, and then the Netherlands turn around and donate it to the Ukrainians, the Dutch do not get to designate how those weapons are used because they're U.S. weapons. And under the agreement, U.S. has a decision of how they are to be sent and how they are to be used. So the U.S. has restrictions on this. Now, of course, the Ukrainians could absolutely ignore the restrictions if they had the technical ability to do so, but also that would jeopardize any other future weapon sales. So the Ukrainians are pretty much have to follow the guidelines and restrictions. The other part is that even European-made weapons often use U.S. technology. I talked also about the Swiss making ammunition for a German air defense cannon, and Swiss law does not allow for the ammunition to be sold to, or any weapons to be sold to a country at war, no matter whether they're aggrieved or the ones that started the war. Well, the United States very much the same way. If a particular, let's say a Dutch weapon that's made by the Netherlands uses a U.S. guidance part, for example, that weapon cannot be used unrestricted by the Ukrainians, even if the Dutch wanted them to be able to use it. So the U.S., and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom, have a lot of say-so in how the weapons are used. The Ukrainians are pushing for them to remove all those restrictions ahead of, so they can attack targets deeper into Russia. So does this really feel like that they're really wanting war? And they're talking about this peace plan, but they're talking about expanding the war. But also President Zelensky has complained, we'll say, because I think that's probably a fair argument, is that the Allies have shot down and have threatened to shoot down any weapons launched towards Israel. Remember, Iran launched hundreds of missiles, and the U.S., United Kingdom, France took part, also the Jordanians. They all took part in shooting down the weapons to protect Israeli airspace. Well, he argues, well, if the Allies can do that for Israel, why can't they do that to Ukraine, where basically NATO starts shooting down any type of weapon flying over Ukraine, just as they did for Israel? Now, what President Zelensky doesn't understand is that would be a NATO operation because those weapons are under the control of NATO countries, and it would be forward military batteries. So these would fall under NATO and not air defense batteries that are meant to protect cities, which has kind of a gray area for NATO. Well, NATO has consensus rules. 100% of the countries have to agree to do that to expand the war. The chances, that means that if they say, NATO General Secretary comes in and says, yes, we want to do this, we want to start shooting down missiles over, Russian missiles down over Ukraine, it just takes one of the 32 countries to say no, and it does not happen. The chances of that happening are close to zero. Okay, so anything's possible, but you can guarantee the Hungarians, the Czechs, the Turks will all most likely veto any attempt to do that. So President Zelensky, the call for it is not necessarily, is kind of an immature statement because he's not, and he has to be well aware of the politics of NATO. And that's part of the rules. Absolute consent is required, 100% consent to do something like that. So Zelensky, ahead of this peace plan, he is talking about doing things to expand the war, the Kursk operation, asking for unrestricted use of weapons against Russia, and also talk about lifting restrictions on shooting down these. But these are probably also leverage points, is that, okay, we have all these options to expand the war into Russia if Russia doesn't come to the peace talks. And initially, the United States and the United Kingdom, President Biden and Prime Minister Starmer met in Washington this week to discuss the use of lifting the restrictions on the weapons. And though the U.S. said they were sympathetic, they will not agree to increase or allow these weapons to be used deeper in Russia, which also aligns with the Germans, who are very strict on it. Now, the U.S. and United Kingdom and Germany do allow some use of weapons inside Russia, but it's mainly around the Kharkiv region in eastern Ukraine. So the Ukrainians can only attack targets that are in something that can conceivably assist in the operations against Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in Ukraine. So maybe these are bargaining chips to help to point out that if the Russians don't come to the peace talks, there are these whole lists of other options, which again are all red lines to the Russians. So it's like you're threatening. One aspect is, hey, we can expand the war and make the war more expensive for you, the Russians, but it's also crossing red lines that the Russians have set out. Now, the Russians at the high level are not really, they issue a lot of red lines, and they haven't done anything about them. But at what point is it's one red line too many that it pushes the Russians to the point? Now, the Russians, for their perspective, are continuing to push harder and harder into eastern Ukraine and to cut off the logistics hub in the Donbass region, which would make operations incredibly difficult for the Ukrainians and would most likely force a strategic retreat. Not a complete failure. It would not collapse the front, but it would make operations much more difficult for the Ukrainians. Resupply would become an issue. Supply lines would become longer, more tenuous. The longer you make supply lines, the longer you make them, the more subject they are to attack. So it would make life harder on the Ukrainians if the logistics hub, Provosk, I think is what it's called, falls to the Russians, and the Russians are pushing hard to take the area. They don't have to seize the town. They just have to be able to cut the road and rail networks around the town to cut off the logistics position for the Ukrainians in that part of eastern Ukraine. President Putin has announced 180,000 recruits to increase the size of the army to 1.5 million, which will increase the armed forces to 2.4 million. He states that these are just not for the Ukrainian war, but for other purposes. That's probably just a statement in general for the Russian population, because the Russian position is the war is going great. Everything's under control. The Ukrainians are losing. And if you're saying that and you say, well, we need 180,000 more soldiers for Ukraine, well, all of a sudden your story kind of falls apart. So he kind of says there that, he talks about it, but, he's increasing the size. So he's increasing the size of the army. It will be used against Ukraine. So the point is both sides are jockeying for position ahead of the peace talks. Now, why I say the peace talks are coming is there is a lot of pressure on both Ukraine and Russia to end this war. A lot of the international community is running weary of the war. And now part of the Russian strategy is they always thought that the West would get tired of this war and would willing to quit, and the Russians would get whatever they wanted out of the Ukraine. Well, so far the West is standing firm, but Germany announced that they would reduce its support to Ukraine in 2025 and has called for a negotiated end to the war. Now, the Germans say, well, we're not cutting the Ukrainians off. What we're doing is we're cutting our economic aid, because there's both economic aid and financial aid that's given to, or I'm sorry, economic aid and military aid that's given to Ukraine. Obviously, military aid is to help fight the war. The economic aid is to keep the Ukrainian economy going, as much of the eastern Ukraine is no longer available. Those resources, gas, minerals, gas, oil, minerals, agriculture, coal, is not available to the Ukrainians. So they do need to have some economic support to keep their economy going, to keep their society going. If they don't keep society going, they won't have the soldiers put in the field. So the support that the Germans are talking about reducing, is that economic support, not the military support. And the Germans justified this is because the G7 agreed that they would give a loan to Ukraine that's backed by the assets, or the interest from assets that the West has frozen, Russian assets that the West has frozen in their banks. So that those assets are still gaining interest. So what they're doing is the G7 and actually the EU, through agreement with the G7 meeting, is issued a loan guarantee to the Ukrainians. And actually, the European Union delivered that aid this week when the European Commission President van der Leyen went to Kyiv to meet with Zelensky. She delivered a large part of that aid that's based on that loan guarantees from the proceeds of frozen Russian assets. So Germany's saying, well, we're not really reducing our support. It's just being taken up by that loan guarantee. Now, that loan guarantee, that means Germany doesn't have to give up any money. The loan is guaranteed by the assets, interest from frozen assets. So even if Ukraine defaults on that loan, the guarantors of the loan just go get the money off from that money that interest money that's sitting in Western banks. So there's no real loss for the Germans or any other countries that are helping help arrange for this loan guarantee. Now, so there's pressure there. Also, the Ukrainians this year had a debt payment coming up from Eurobond holders, and they failed to meet it, but they renegotiated it. And part of it was that about 1/3 of the Ukrainian debt was forgiven by the bondholders, and that repayments would start as soon as the war was over. And, well, not all the payments, but the payments would be reduced while the war is still in progress. And there were indications given that the war would wind down in 2025, and that Euro bondholders would not give any more loans to Ukraine until after the war was over. So there seems to be strong indications given to those Euro bondholders that something would happen in 2025 to facilitate peace. Now, the Chinese on their side, which has been a large supporter of the Russians, not by providing direct assistance as far as military assistance goes, but they have been providing money by offering buying Russian oil and gas, talking about helping build more pipelines from Russian gas fields to go to China. Also, China provides a lot of dual-use products. These are products that are used both for civilian application and military applications. I'll give you an example of something that happened, I think, last week, and this has been coming up several times, is they found the debris from Russian missiles that landed in Ukraine. They had chips that were used by an unnamed American company that makes machines and calculators. That they use chips that are made in basically low-grade chips that are made in China. these chips were found in those Russian warheads. So that's an idea of a dual use item. It has a civilian use for, let's say, calculators, and it also has uses in missiles. So that's an idea of a dual use product. A truck would be another one. Machine tools would be another. It could make machine tools to make, I don't know, cars, but also could be used to make tanks. So that's like an idea of a dual use product. So China's been providing that. Well, the West has been more aggressive in this and has been accused China of this, and have stated it to the point that China is considered a enemy or a danger to European security because of the amount of support they provide the Russians in their war in Ukraine. So you're starting to see more moves from the West in the sanction regime towards the Chinese. So there's been mounting pressure on Chinese banks because, again, Chinese banks arrange for the payment processing for these trades in dual-use products. Well, the Chinese banks are being focused on as possible targets for sanctions. Now, they do make money selling to the Russians, and the Russians need those products, and the Chinese government is sympathetic to the Russian cause. Though, in all fairness, China probably wishes this war would end because I think the usefulness to the Chinese have kind of run its course. So the Chinese are ready for this war to end for the large part, but they don't want to, also they're not going to press hard to abandon the Russian government, their ally, the alliance with no boundaries, I think is what they call it. So, but there's increasing pressure on these Chinese banks. Again, they do make money selling to the Russians, and of course they have to be sold in Russian currency or whatever currency the Chinese demand of the Russians. I'm sure that they're not taking a lot of Russian rubles. They're probably taking payments in gold, oil, other hard currencies that the Russians have. I'm quite sure the Chinese banks are not taking a lot of rubles right now. So these Chinese banks also arrange for payments to support foreign trade to the West. And you can guarantee the biggest economies in the world are in the West. European Union as a whole has a bigger economy than the United States. Then you have the United States, and both have bigger economies than China. So there's a lot of lucrative trade for a country that is based on being the, quote, factory of the world, being able to trade to the West. Those Western contracts are much more lucrative than supporting the Russian war effort. So the threat of losing Western trade over supporting the dual use trade with Russia weighs heavily on the Chinese. And as much as the Chinese government puts pressure on the banks, if the banks won't arrange for it, even under pressure from Chinese regulators, there is a lot of bureaucratic red tape if the government gets involved in the banking sector. So it's something the Chinese do not want to go in there and take over the banks. They try to pressure the banks, but the banks have to look at it as if they lose that Western trade, they face the possibility of themselves going bankrupt. And also, if the trade is restricted from the West, that is going to create real headwinds like unemployment in China, because Russia cannot make up for that trade from the West. So the Chinese have economic reasons to pursue the end of this war as well. So it seems like many things are lining up that there will be, not saying that there will be peace, but there will be a real push to have peace, maybe even a ceasefire sometime in 2025. The idea is the Ukrainians want to start peace talks in 2024, in November 2024. There is some background diplomatic shuffling with the Indians between Ukraine and Russia, and I've written about that earlier as well. So it will be interesting to see what this plan looks like when it's rolled out to the General Assembly next week, and give the world a better view of how difficult it is going to be for both sides to come to talking to and willing to end the war. It doesn't seem like they're really willing to end the war. There's jockeying positions to try to threaten to expand the war. There's territorial concession issues I talked about. Um, it will not be easy to end this war. And it kind of goes back to my whole point is that this war has been an absolute disaster. And the sooner we negotiate an end to it as a world, the better we are. And just to kind of close out, this war right now is averaging 1,100 casualties a day. To put it in perspective, though the battlefield's much smaller, the average casualty rate in the Gaza war, which has peace talks going on, is about 394 a day. Now, you can argue that the ratio of people between Russia and Ukraine and Gaza and Israel is much smaller. So you can argue that probably the war in Gaza, you have a higher likelihood of becoming a casualty in Gaza than you do in Ukraine, but it's still significant amount of lives that the world 1,100 a day that the world has not been putting a lot of pressure to end this war. So maybe it'll come up. The economics are starting to line up. If China can't support, the West doesn't want to support, Euro bondholders don't want to support, and then you have populations that probably don't want to keep supporting the war either. Economics and finances might force an end to the war, despite what either country wants. So more to come. Be interesting to see how this is presented and how it is received within the General Assembly. Expect the Russians to not be open to it. It's what happens afterwards in the diplomacy issues. So it'll be interesting to say. I hope it is complete change from the 10-point peace plan, which to me was absolute ridiculous standard. It was not a roadmap for peace. I hope this one is better. The Russians aren't presenting one either. They haven't really presented a real peace plan other than telling the Ukrainians to surrender. So ball has been in the court of the Ukrainians to come up with a way to end this war, which sometimes seems to put them in a disadvantaged position in the war when Russia's not really putting much effort to try to find a settlement forward. Outside of saying that they accepted the idea that the Turkish peace plan from 2022 was an acceptable blueprint for peace. So we will see. Again, I wrote about that last week. So interesting article if you want to check that one out too. All right, so this one will be a real quick one. What's next for Boeing Starliner? Oh, Starliner spacecraft, that hapless Starliner spacecraft, returned to Earth earlier this month. It successfully landed. So in the end, the astronauts could have returned safely, and the Starliner could have addressed the issues and go on. But the fact that it had to leave the crew behind on the International Space Station due to concerns over thrusters and helium leaks now leaves a problem. Now, this is not to say that NASA's decision was wrong, because safety is of utmost concern. NASA did get burned when it had apparently bypassed safety during the Challenger accident and the Columbia accident that killed a total of 14 astronauts. NASA is going to side on the side of caution. And does this mean that NASA has become a careful organization and is not really up to the dangers of spaceflight, because spaceflight is dangerous? Not at all, necessarily, because the fact that they had Starliner, they had Crew Dragon from SpaceX, and the Soyuz that they wanted to use, sign another contract with the Russians, which they actually still do have a contract with the Russians, just a much diminished contract with the Russians, is they have options. They didn't have to risk the crew when they could just say, well, let's leave them on the space station. They're safe. They'll just come back on a Crew Dragon that's proven itself in, I think, 14 manned missions, 13 returned, because you still have Crew 8 up in at the space station. So they've got 14 successful launches and 13 successful returns. So they didn't need to risk the two-man crew of the Starliner on what they viewed as a potentially faulty spacecraft, because they did have the option, because there is a redundant backup to Starliner, and that's being the the Crew Dragon spaceship from SpaceX. So why risk a crew and risk the future of the Artemis mission, which is already facing difficulties? Is if they lost the Starliner crew because of some decision that NASA made, it would have most likely ended the Artemis program, the SLS program, along with the Orion space capsule. And that was the space capsule that took off last year that actually did a circumnavigation of the moon. First one of a man-capable spaceship since the Apollo days. I mean, obviously, there's been other countries that have launched probes to the moon, but nobody has launched a capsule, the Orion, that is capable of supporting human life to the moon since Apollo. So NASA didn't want to risk this crew because if it did, it would have basically ended the program. But also, if they allowed the Starliner crew to land, the whole conversation around Starliner would be entirely different. They wouldn't be talking about another test flight necessarily. They would have just said, hey, Boeing, fix your helium leaks, fix your thruster issues, which seems to be tied back to a Teflon seals around the thrusters. But they don't know for sure, but they kind of suspect. And they don't know for sure because they had to cast aside the service module on the return. So they've lost a lot of their evidence. That's why they spent so long up there. But now they're stuck with this part. They've got the astronauts still on the International Space Station. They did successfully return the Starliner to Earth. And I want to make note is, despite the issues that Starliner has had, they have had 3 successful returns to Earth that the astronauts would have been safely returned, would have been safe, on target, and they were able to do that. So that's something that you could look at as positive, because it's often considered that the most difficult part of space travel is the return. And Starliner successfully has done that. Crew SpaceX has as well. So there is something to be said about the safety of the Starliner. That the first time it failed to make rendezvous, first time it got into orbit, success, was unable to make contact or unable to dock with this was the first unmanned flight Starliner. It was unable to dock automatically with the space station because of a clock issue. And then they later found out there's some issues that they found upon the return of Starliner around the thrusters. And then the second launch was it was successful, but it was long delayed. It took about a year and a half, I think it was a year and a half between the first unmanned launch and the second unmanned launch, because you had to have a successful unmanned launch before to the International Space Station before NASA would agree to put a crew on. They did the second launch. It was apparently successful, and then but there were still issues that delayed it even further once it returned. Finally had this manned mission, and it failed to return to the crew. But all 3 times Starliner was able to get to orbit safely. All 3 times Starliner has been able to return to Earth safely. The crew would have been safe. So from mission objectives, yes, Starliner has had issues and they have failed. From the perspective of doing the basic of getting up in orbit and getting back down safely, it is 3 for 3. So let's give credit to Starliner and Boeing from that perspective. Again, it's small compared to what SpaceX has done with Crew Dragon, but it's a start. But it was a big loss that they couldn't bring the crew back. I mean, that's the whole idea. That's the measure of true success, is that they could have got up there, docked, and returned the crew. So by deciding not to allow the crew to be on Starliner, it has created an issue now for Starliner. Starliner is $2 billion in debt over it. And that's not including all the money that it would receive from NASA if it successfully goes operational and docks with the space station and returns. This launch where up there where they put the two astronauts, that was a test launch. That was not an operational launch. That also means that Boeing has to run another test launch before they can get to that operational part of their contract where they will start getting paid by NASA. NASA paid for one unmanned test, and NASA paid for one manned test. They failed on the first unmanned test, so Boeing had to put the Starliner up there and pay for it itself. NASA paid for the manned space flight up this current Starliner. That means that they still have to have a successful manned launch. And from the perspective of NASA, that means launch with a crew, get into orbit, get to the space station, and return back to Earth with the same crew to be a success. So the next Starliner launch, which will be the fourth Starliner launch, this one will be paid for by Boeing on a program that's already $2 billion in debt and cost overruns. So, and they can only say that they had only one successful unmanned flight, even though I did talk about some of the credit that they deserve in the basics of the program. So the question is, NASA plans to deorbit, the International Space Station in 2030. And they actually just contracted with SpaceX to do that work. I think the original idea is that the Russians would be the ones that would do the deorbit burn. But because of the current geopolitical situation, that's not possible. Then they thought Boeing Starliner, because Boeing Starliner does have larger thrusters and more thrusters than what the Crew Dragon has. The Starliner is an incredibly maneuverable vehicle, even you could say more so than the Crew Dragon. Maybe that means that maybe they didn't follow a simplistic path to get to space. They maybe over-engineered something. But also the Boeing Starliner was supposed to be a system that could boost the orbit of the International Space Station, because it is high up on orbit, around 230 miles. There is, the atmosphere is largely gone, but there is still some atmospheric drag. So as it keeps going through orbit, it starts losing more, very, very small, but it loses more and more altitude as it gets some atmospheric drag. So occasionally it has to be booted back into orbit. The Russians take that function. The Boeing Starliner was supposed to take that function as well. So NASA not wanting to wait, knowing that they're going to try to deorbit the International Space Station by 2030, they signed a contract with SpaceX for SpaceX to build a prototype to deorbit. Basically means it's going to slow it down and allow for a precise crashing into the ocean, basically called the space graveyard, which is, I think, the part of the southern hemisphere between Australia and South America, to ditch the International Space Station. So SpaceX will do that. Boeing will not, and the Russians will not. So this means that by 2030, that's the amount of time that Boeing has to get back up there. And their basic contract is for 6 manned flights, operational flights to the space station, where they'll get paid. Now it's 2024, obviously, and Boeing has till 2030 to fulfill that contract. Even if the Boeing gets 6 or 7 crewed launches and max out its ability, it can carry 7 astronauts. If it maxed out its ability, it could just break even on theory. But that means that, again, they still have to address the issues with Starliner. 2030 keeps getting closer. So let's say it takes a year and a half for them to fix the Starliner issues. That pushes us up to, call it, 2026. That's only 4 years to get 6 or 7 crewed launches. Well, typically, because the way the rotations go, it's right now they're only expecting about 2030 launch date. They're only going to get 6, maybe 7 launches each between SpaceX and Boeing. So let's say Boeing doesn't get up there till 2026. Well, they still have that rotation. So what's happened is either NASA has to give SpaceX another one or two missions, or they get more from the Russians, because they still have that contract with Russia, a much diminished contract with the Russians, but they do have a contract with the Russians. And then that leaves Boeing with, let's say, 4 launches. And that's, they cannot, at that point, even if they put a 7-person crew on that, they could, and NASA paid for every single seat, which they're not, they are past the break even. They cannot break even. There's no chance of them breaking even. So that means at this point that even if they fix Starliner, they're still going to operate at a loss. They may be able to operate at less of a loss, but if they say, no, we're not going to do anything, they just cut their losses at the $2 billion plus any seed money they have to pay back to NASA. It might be easier just to cut now and say, well, yeah, right now we're $2 billion in debt. Let's say we had to pay back NASA all the $4 billion we got, plus we don't fulfill our contract. So we're $6 billion in the hole, but let's say it's going to cost us another $4 billion to fix Starliner. At that point, it's just easier just to take the loss and just, wash your hands of Starliner and be done with it. So even though both NASA and Boeing have said in public that they want to get Starliner flying, the profitability of Starliner is looking less and less likely. And to make things even tougher for Boeing, which has already taken a beating this year, and even the year before that, mainly in their commercial airline business, is there's a strike at Boeing right now, and they've had to furlough a number of workers, and they don't know how long this strike is going to last. So 2030 again is still coming, and nothing is occurring on Starliner while this strike is occurring. So basically all work is stopped on Starliner, which is again going to put more economic pressure. So again, and Boeing is somewhat cash strapped. So does it really make sense for them to continue with Starliner? And that's a real question. And that would be a loss for NASA, because the reason why NASA was able to make the decision they did by leaving Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams on the International Space Station is because having a redundancy of having another space crew, human-rated spaceship, Crew Dragon, gave them the option that they could go up there and retrieve them on their own without having to go to the Russians to bring them back, which would have been much more difficult because of seating arrangements with Soyuz. You have a lot more flexibility with Crew Dragon, and even much more flexibility with Starliner as far as the amount of crew that can be carried. So the loss of Starliner means that, again, the U.S. is wholly reliant on just one use. And that was the whole idea when they signed the 2 contracts. I'm trying to remember the NASA administrator, Gershenmeyer or something like that, his name. And I apologize for not remembering. He had the ideas that we needed redundancy. And the idea is if you have SpaceX and you have Starliner, these 2 systems run completely different spacecrafts, have completely different supply lines, uses different launch vehicles, use different company resources. They have their own locations within launch locations, so they don't share launch facilities. These 2 companies are completely independent of each other, and that means they are truly redundant. That means that if something happens with Starliner, it does not affect Crew Dragon. If something happens to Crew Dragon, it does not affect Starliner. These are truly 2 redundant programs. If Starliner goes away, that redundancy is lost. And so just like when the space shuttle was grounded and the U.S. had no way of getting people to the International Space Station without relying on the Russians, if something happened to the Crew Dragon, and let's hope nothing ever happens, that means that they have no way of getting up to the International Space Station until SpaceX is up and running, on the assumption that Boeing has quit. Now, there is Sierra Space and the Dream Chaser that's out there, but that's probably not going to be available till 2027, at least, at the earliest. And they'd only have a manned contract with NASA, from my understanding. So it really puts a difficult situation for NASA that just putting all their eggs in the SpaceX basket. SpaceX has proven themselves. The Falcon 9 has proven itself to be the most reliable rocket ever made. It has flown I can't remember its record, but it's already had 90 launches this year. Now, what has not, and this throws out the not even bringing up the argument between SpaceX and the FAA over Starship. Excuse me, I'm sorry. You have the issue with Starline, with the issues that SpaceX has actually been grounded twice this year. Now, they are very short groundings, and they were groundings that would not have impacted any type of space flight. These are during satellite launches, I think, for the Starlink. So it didn't impact. They were still able to get their payload successfully in orbit, but they did lose. They did have loss of boosters. One was it landed and a leg broke and blew up. The other one, I think, is a oxygen leak in the second stage, I believe. So SpaceX has been grounded twice. So even with the highly reliable Falcon 9, there has been cases where the Falcon 9 has been grounded this year. So even with the most reliable rocket ever, things still go wrong. Spaceflight is still dangerous, and the loss of Starliner as an option, the redundancy, would be a significant risk to NASA, especially if something happened to the Falcon 9. So the other issue is that, well, if Boeing can't make the money up on the space station contract, there is the space tourism business. Just like Starliner is in the space tourism business with two big space tourist missions, plus other tourist missions it's used, but it's had ones where they haven't been involved with the space station at all. And that was like, for example, the last mission they had where they did spacewalk. So the Boeing envisioned Starliner being available for space tourism. Now, the issue with Starliner in the space tourism business and trying to use tourism as a way to get make Starliner profitable is it's a very small sector. There's not a lot of billionaires out there that are willing to go to space or pay other people to go to space. Boeing's reputation has taken a beating, not only with Starliner, but as I said, with their airline reputation. If you had the choice of going up with a SpaceX Dragon or a Starliner made by Boeing, it's pretty easy to see what the majority of the public would go. So does Boeing think that that's something that could be still profitable? Also, we don't know what the private space station industry looks like. It is expected before the space station or shortly after the space station is deorbited that there will be several private space industries or several private industries that will be creating space stations. In fact, there has been some modules on the current space station that are test products from private companies on the future of space stations. So maybe they view that maybe once they see how that shapes up, that they leave Starliner available to help with that. The issue with that is that means that you're talking about 2030, so you're talking 6 years away. Less than that, really. Depends on what part of 2030 they deorbit the International Space Station, but let's just say 6 years. Well, if they stop work to save money on the Starliner, that basically they're foregoing what the private space market and space station market might look like. Maybe there isn't a way that they can make money on this. So they have a lot of critical decisions to look at. Can they make up the money in the private market, but knowing that they have a reputational issue, and then they still have to spend the money to get Starliner up and running. The other issue that run into is United Launch Alliance, ULA, is a 50% owned company. Boeing owns 50%, Lockheed Martin owns 50%. They both want to sell ULA. ULA provides the rockets for Starliner. If they sell Sierra Space, the one that's making the Dream Chaser, is a company that ULA has approached about buying it. that means that Starliner doesn't have a guaranteed rocket. Sierra Space might say, well, no, you can buy a rocket from us or ride on one of our rockets, but if Sierra Space has something else they want to do with those rockets, basically what they're buying from ULA, that doesn't guarantee a slot unless they make that part of the sale. But also the sale of ULA could help pay for Starliner. So that could help make it, give cash to Boeing to make a decision if they want to keep Starliner. And there is also Blue Origin that's coming out. So that's the Jeff Bezos company. Is you can assume that Starliner is not going to get put on top of a Falcon 9 rocket, but you never know if you want to get back up in space, because I think even Jeff Bezos has actually used a Falcon 9 launch to put up some of his test satellites that will eventually be launched by Blue Origin. So maybe Blue Origin comes around and they can put the Starliner on top of a Blue Origin rocket. I think that's within the realm of possibility as well. So lots of questions for Boeing. Again, I'm a big space nerd, so I hope that the best for Starliner. Again, I'm a big fan of SpaceX and what they've done. I gripe about what the FAA is doing with the Starship program, but that's maybe another conversation for future weeks. So that is it for this week. I went a little long. I apologize. Normally, I would not have put the Starliner article in there since it just got published today, but it seemed like a relatively short article, which might make next week a little bit shorter. So sorry if it went a little bit long. Thank you for all the new supporters. I had a setback this week where I lost about 7% of my supporters when I did the Ukrainian victory plan. Apparently, I didn't see any negative comments necessarily, but I did see as soon as I printed that, I lost 7 followers, but I've gained them back later this week. So I'm back up to about 140, and I've crossed over 300. So I'm at 140 subscribers and 307 followers, I believe, last I checked. So thank you for all the new people joining on. Thank you for all people that have been with me since the beginning and after. It is greatly appreciated. I appreciate the comments on Substack. Very interesting. The comments on YouTube, less interesting. But comments are comments. But again, I appreciate everybody listening. I am also interested. My podcasts have been listened to in 43 countries now. So it's been kind of holding steady at 43, even when you cut down the time period from the time that I've been on it, because I'm approaching a year on Substack, but also go back 3 months. I've been holding right around 43. So welcome all the listeners. It seems kind of humbling to be listened by so many people, but it is greatly appreciated. And of course, they're not listening to just this. There's RSS feeds for my other things I post as well, so they can listen to them there. So thank you very much. If you have any comments, you can please reach out to me on Substack. I will be happy to answer them. I don't think there's any comment on Substack that I haven't answered. There was somebody that posted some stuff about the Ukraine war. I think they were just posting articles in general because they didn't leave me any comments. So I didn't answer those, but very interesting read nonetheless about some of the positions of the Ukraine war. It's a highly complex issue. I know that there's many feelings both ways on it. A lot of emotions tied into the Ukraine war for both supporters and detractors of the Ukraine war. As you can see, because I don't really try to call it fanboy anybody in the Ukraine war and trying to kind of report my point of view. And my point of view is the war needs to end, though I know that any peace, a just peace for Ukraine, is going to be very hard to obtain. So I have kind of a complex view of the war myself, but just writing about it alone, I lost 7 subscribers on that just over not being one side or the other. And boy, look at the comments on YouTube when you put it out there. So, and the spam you get. It's a lot of fun. So anyway, thank you very much for listening this week. And I hope all of you have a great rest of your weekend. And we will talk to you next week. Bye-bye.